How did the Giants' moves in free agency shape their plans for the draft? What can we expect from the Giants' offense and defense in year 2 under Brian Daboll? And what about the draft? What surprises might be in store for the Giants there? We talk about all this and more with special guest Mike Golic Jr. coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm Patricia Traynor, your host, and joining me on the pod is somebody who you guys saw last month, but you liked him so much, you said, Pat, you've got to have him back on the show. He is back on the show with me, is Mike Golic Jr. He is the host of the GoJo Podcast over on DraftKings. Mike, thanks so much for coming back on the show with me.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you to apparently the tens of people who decided that I appreciate you listening to the people on that one. Whoever went to bat for me, thank you on that. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm glad to have you back because you're such a fountain of knowledge. And speaking of which, I'm going to pick your brain. So hopefully you got some good stuff for me today. So let's jump right into it, Mike. Want to talk a little bit about the draft coming up. Now, obviously you were on with me about three and a half weeks ago. Since then, we've had, pro days, we've had some movement with free agency and whatnot. Have you noticed any shifts in perhaps how teams might be targeting the draft, given, the activities that they've done? And specifically, we look at the Giants, since this is a Giants podcast, the Giants added off-ball linebacker. They added some run defense help. But has anything shifted, maybe the priorities and how they look at the draft in a few weeks?
So I don't think overwhelmingly, like you might be like with Bobby Okereke coming over, you might be able to downgrade that as a priority a little bit, because I think especially of the defensive players the Giants brought over, you had Rakim Nunez-Roches, Bobby McCain. The rest of that group are guys that might be able to supplement. I don't know if they're necessarily ones that have to change your plans wholesale. And so that might be the one, but outside of that, I mean, when we talked last time, the Giants' needs were largely, off-ball linebacker, which I think you could still address now, maybe, second day into the third day of the draft, even more, some cornerback needs, obviously losing Julian Love. You've got some people on the roster already that might be able to help, but interior offensive line, a lot of the needs still end up looking the same if you're the Giants. There's a lot that's changed around them, and I will be curious, especially in that first round, how this looks, because anytime you've got quarterbacks the way you do this year, and I think a couple of really blue chip defensive prospects, you're going to get a lot of movement and volatility. We're seeing rumors lately now. I think Daniel Jeremiah over at the NFL Network talked about the Titans maybe as a team that's a candidate to try and trade up with the Cardinals at the 3 pick. And so the trickle down effect of all of that movement with the first round picks that could be wheeling and dealing is always, I think, something to keep an eye on, because that's, the beauty of what happens when we've got quarterbacks that everyone wants.
Right. Now, one of the things the Giants really haven't done is they haven't addressed the offensive line. And, they just invested big money in Daniel Jones. Joe Shane at the league meetings last week was like, okay, we've got some guys that are going to compete. He mentioned Ben Bredesen at center, a guy who played 30 snaps there last year. They've mentioned some guys at left guard, Azudu, who was a draft pick for them last year. Shane Lemieux, who unfortunately hasn't been able to stay healthy the last couple of years. Were you surprised that the Giants didn't go for a veteran option, especially after losing John Feliciano, the center that started for them last year, and Nick Gates, the backup?
Yeah, I was, just because you mentioned Daniel Jones now becomes the prism through which you see every Giants decision made. And we all know, while this is a great deal for for Daniel, I was thinking of Andrew Thomas as we get set to talk about the people protecting him. While it's a great deal for Daniel, we know what it is. It's really a 2-year deal, front loaded with a bunch of money to allow them to try and do what they're doing now, go out and bring him weapons, continue to get answers, and see if the progress they saw last year continues to ascend or levels off so they can make that decision, which means usually you want to prioritize veteran offensive linemen, because coming in, we've seen that the Giants are the perfect case study for this. Look at Andrew Thomas, who's now playing like a Pro Bowl caliber player. It took a while to get going. I think the same is going to be said for Evan Neal on the right side. Is, yeah, you saw some things early on, dealt with a little bit of injury, a little bit of inconsistency. A lot of it reminded me of Andrew early on, because they're players that aren't, perfect comps, but I thought were similar enough, just physical gifts, length, both coming from blue blood SEC programs. And so using those as kind of a marker of how this position can sometimes need to be developed at this level, entrusting that to even high draft picks still seems like a risk that I was surprised they would take, considering the investment they just made in quarterback.
You just mentioned Evan Neal. I was going to ask you this a little later on in the program, but since we're on the topic here, when you look at his game last year, he had the injuries. He made the move from left tackle to right tackle. I mean, what are you what are the realistic expectations for him in year 2? Where does he need to take the biggest jump, do you think?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously staying on the field, staying healthy is a big priority, and that just getting the reps. He's a guy that did play a lot of football at Alabama. For him, it's always just, I think, staying balanced. With Evan, he's got so many incredible gifts. He's coming out of college, was one of my favorite pass blockers in that class. Was actually, I thought, a better run blocker than he even got credit for. Incredibly scheme versatile, but sometimes can get a little bit overextended. He's a big, tall, long guy. And so those things, when you get to the NFL and everybody, even compared to the SEC talent you were facing, is that much stronger, that much bigger, you see some young offensive linemen end up getting overextended. You're on the ground. Mike Tomlin used to always yell, "Don't trip the athletes." So that kind of thing, I think, just that consistency of keeping his feet under him, whether that's in the run or in the pass, because I think you saw it show up in both spots last year, and just maintaining that level of consistency while also, hopefully luck is part of the injury equation too. So being lucky enough, but also taking care of himself enough to be on the field.
And while we're on the topic of last year's first round draft picks, let's also talk about Kayvon Thibodeaux. Where can he take the next step in his development here in year 2?
I think now for him, it's going to be more like all the attention that he's going to get, because the back half of last year, we saw it started to pop. That started to be the Kayvon Thibodeaux that we saw at Oregon. And so now it's going to be, all right, you're going to probably seeing the lion's share of attention coming from other teams, especially with, listen, he was a guy that has no problem putting a target on his back. He's very self-confident, likes to talk, good with the media. And so he's going to be a guy coming in. You're not going to have to wait long to find 5. And so I think just dealing with that extra attention, because with him, it was always, the motor's such a great sell with him. I think his, pass rush moves have developed really nicely. That was always something he did pretty well at Oregon, and we saw last year start to improve a little bit more. And so just, consistency with the attention that's now going to come with a successful year 1.
Hey, Giant fans, the NBA playoffs are almost here, and there's no better place to get in on the action than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if their first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to the point scores to which team will be hoisting the trophy. Make every moment more with FanDuel. We look at draft picks. I think even though a guy might be considered NFL ready, to a certain degree, every draft pick is developmental. He's got to come into the league. He's got to learn how to take care of himself. He's got to learn how to deal with power, speed, depending on what position he's playing. That being said, when you look at the class in general, what separates a guy who is maybe a little bit more NFL ready than a developmental prospect? Because again, everybody has something they can work on. So in terms of kind of stacking the board, especially when you have grades that are clustered together, how do you kind of just say to yourself, okay, this guy, I can plug him in as a day 1 starter versus this guy maybe mid-year versus this guy maybe next year?
Yeah, well, and first off, those are all position specific, right? With, take a group like this year where you've got running back, one of the deepest running back classes that we've had in a while, one where people are pretty confident in a lot of guys going on through that. You can get 10 or 11 deep in guys that feel like they're going to be pretty quality in that class. You start with the Bijan Robinsons, Jahmyr Gibbs of the world, but you work all the way down to Kendre Miller from TCU, Tank Bigsby from Auburn. There's a flavor of ice cream for everybody at a position where the bar to clear to come in, the barrier to entry is a lot lower because of what's asked. We see, some rookies are going to struggle with pass protection on third down or how they fit into the pass scheme there, and that might limit some of their effectiveness, but overall, that position, wide receiver, we've seen, because the NFL game's meeting the college game halfway, is a lot easier to get guys on the field. So I think, one, accounting for what your position of need is, but I think I would always go to, one, a lot of the size paradigms. Like if you're looking for guys that you can bet on and try and get out there early, a guy who can physically stand up to the toll, because you're adding games to the season. It's a big jump from college to pro in that regard. And the NFL will keep adding more games now in the regular and postseason. So you want a guy who's physically going to have something to hang his hat on, because you're right, they're all going to develop in something. So you need one thing you really can go to. That's why speed always kills. That's why people are always trying to get fastest, strongest, someone who's going to stand up to that. And I think in a lot of the positions, I've always campaigned when it comes to offensive line development for young players or young guys you want to get out there, is you've got to go to pedigree programs. If you want someone who's going to get on the field early, you need someone who's been in a system that's going to challenge them from the neck up. That's why Georgia defensive players, always an easy sell. We saw with Nolan Smith at the Combine, he put on one of the best recruiting pitches for a football program in college I've ever seen, because he sounded like Kirby Smart out there describing his responsibilities on defense. And that wasn't on the board in some meeting room. That was in an NFL Network interview. That's a guy who comes not only with incredible physical gifts, but also a pedigree program that we know challenges their players and what they're asked to do. And so guys like that, Michael Merritt, Notre Dame at tight end, is a great example of that, of a guy who physically maybe didn't blow people away at the Combine as expected, but big enough, strong enough, sturdy enough, great contested catches, and played in an offense that featured the tight end heavily, that had a lot of the shifts and motions that are a part of the NFL. And so I think in some of those spaces, especially when you're looking for immediate impact, you want guys where you've seen them do it in ways that are going to mimic some of what you're asking in the NFL, but also have the physical prowess to stand out at that level, because then up at the next level, you're going to blend in a little more.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, also there's getting used to the coaching. I mean, sometimes players come up, especially in the pit, and their techniques are tweaked a little bit, or their stances are changed a little bit. And it takes some getting used to, I would imagine.
It's, to me, the biggest part of, and I think when teams in the NFL are making picks, it requires a tremendous amount of honesty of what are we able to absorb and actually change, understanding your coaching personnel to say, hey, if we're one of the teams that has the legitimate game changers at offensive line, you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, right? What they've got there and what they've developed across that offensive line is incredible coaching. You've got veterans in the room that are going to be able to be helpful, like all these things that are the perfect incubator for young talent that you're going to bring on that team, because you don't even need to get to the coaching voice half the time. You've got a whole room full of guys that are going to make that difference and show you the standard right away. And so you're right, for every team, it's got to be an understanding of, the Kansas City Chiefs, Super Bowl champions, are a great example. They bring Juwan Taylor over and let Orlando Brown walk this offseason. That's a confidence and a bet on their system and their way of doing things. And so if you don't have that, then you've got to be honest about, all right, what are we realistically going to be able to change, make better, and improve with our guys, especially, like you said, in the trenches where it's so technical. That can be such the difference at the NFL level when guys are making the jump. We hear that all the time, especially about young defensive linemen coming into the NFL, where they're still working on that run pass difference and, how hard the play action cells change them. All of those things matter when you're self-scouting yourself as an organization heading into the draft.
When you look at this draft class, I mean, we're almost done with pro days. Teams are doing top 30 visits and whatnot. Who are some of the prospects that maybe we weren't talking about a few weeks ago that are maybe rising up the boards that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, we mentioned one already with a lot of the with a lot of the Georgia prospects. I think looking what happens there, I think Peter Skoronski out of Northwestern is going to be really interesting. I don't know if we've heard as much buzz as I expected we would, considering he was one of the names going into the season. But top of the NFL draft, I think people are always looking for that tackle that could potentially do the Zach Martin and flip into guard. And while I think Peter should get the chance and the opportunity to begin his career at tackle in the NFL, I think he's a guy that, because of his build, has that potential and has that opportunity. Nolan Smith was the Georgia player I was reaching for before, who is going to challenge people now because he's a bit of a tweener on the edge, a little bit undersized in the 230s, but my God, all of the gifts that he had there. I think the other one, and I've been very offensive line heavy this week, so excuse me for barfing this out into the masses, but DeJuan Jones is a fascinating conundrum to me. The offensive tackle out of Ohio State. He's opposite Paris Johnson, who's going to be another highly picked player. And he's like 6'8", 380 pounds. His body makes no sense. He's built like one of the trolls from Harry Potter. And technically you watch him and there's players that are better than him, but part of the game is just preventing the defensive player from getting to your quarterback. And when your player is a literal mountain, that becomes a lot easier. And so I think the conversation around him is going to be fascinating and really interesting. And then this year's wide receiver crop is wild. And I think we're seeing, coming off the Ohio State Pro Day, a lot of renewed conversation around Jackson Smith-Njigba, who we know was injured all last year, is in a draft class with Zay Flowers and Josh Downs from North Carolina that's very slot heavy. But again, if you're looking and betting on a particular position from a particular school under a particular coach, man, Ohio State wide receiver seems like a pretty easy one to hang your hat on, given what they've been able to do there with Brian Hartline coaching them up.
One of the big mysteries I know for me is always figuring out day 3, because that's when I suspect a lot of the grades really start to cluster together. Where do you see the best value for a team like the Giants on a day 3, on day 3 selections, where I think they've got 3 7th rounders. I think they've got 4th rounder, a 5th rounder, two 5th rounders and a 6th rounder. So where's the best value for them on day 3, do you think?
So I saw this, actually. I was looking at a couple of mocks for them, and I saw somebody had them in the 7th round taking Drake Thomas out of NC State. There isn't a player that I loved watching in college football this season more than that guy. And again, you don't expect the 7th rounder to come in and make a huge impact. He wouldn't be the guy that saves your franchise day 1 or anything like that. But man, that guy played with a jetpack on his back at all times. In what I thought was, even with Clemson involved, could have had a testament to the ACC's best linebacking core. Isaiah Moore was sort of their captain there. Drake Thomas's brother Thayer was a great wide receiver on the other side for them, but Drake was always the one showing up, making physical plays. He looked like a pinball out there. He found contact. He was incredibly disruptive. He played sideline to sideline. And so I know the measurables physically aren't going to all be there, but I think every once in a while at that position, whether he's a guy that ends up filling out on teams and just providing some depth, that was one I saw that I was like, oh yeah, that's a perfect Giants player. And also just one of my favorite dudes from this class.
Hey, Giant fans, thanks so much for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen or watch every single day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez provide in-depth coverage of the biggest NFL draft prospects with deep dives into the sleepers and hidden gems that can change your favorite NFL franchise. Find Locked On NFL Draft wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Hey, Giant fans, before you know it, spring football will be in full bloom here at the NFL, and the Giants will be back on the field as they start to shape their roster for 2023. We'll be bringing you everything you need to know, from the mini camps to the OTAs and beyond. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at Patricia_Traina and on Instagram at Patty Traina, PATTITRAINA, for the latest clips, interviews, and much more. Just going back to the Giants for a moment, you look at the free agent acquisitions and the trade, of course, that they made over the last few weeks. What clues can we pull from the moves they've made on offense as far as how they're going to maybe evolve this offense in year two?
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, going out and grabbing right away one of the better tight ends in the NFL is usually a good indicator, right? Like they looked around and they brought back a bunch of the wide receivers that had still been on the team. They liked some of that continuity for Jones down the end of the season, but I think having a running back, you already, Saquon Barkley on the franchise tag, you're, I think, pretty content on trying to find a way to keep. Combining that with a tight end, you want to keep building this thing down the spine. I think that's where the Giants were so good last year. And now it allows you to do so many things in the play action game off of so much of the dominant running that you were having with Saquon for a lot of last year. Tight end allows you to get the ball out of your hand a little bit quicker, so keep hits off Daniel Jones. And in general, it allows for a lot of versatility that we saw. We mentioned Brian Daboll. That was not the offense that they ran necessarily in Buffalo. Dawson Knox is a great player, but they didn't use him, I think, that like they're going to use Darren Waller, like Darren Waller was used during his time in Las Vegas. And so I think that just increases what they want to do. They want to put more on Daniel's plate, and they want to give him versatile pieces on that offense. But now what that's going to require, and has been underscored by our conversation, is you got to have the line to be able to hold up and do that. And now play action, a heavy amount of that will help. Having a tight end who's in there and a part of the attack, that helps all that, because you give the defense a lot of things to think about, gives you that half second to slow down the rush maybe, but it's still got to be a priority. But it's definitely an offense that was incredibly fun to watch last year because they made such great use. Finally, I mean, I feel like Giants fans have been crying out, waiting for Daniel Jones' legs to become a consistent part of the conversation. And now when you pair that with hopefully Saquon Barkley back, Darren Waller in that tight end room, and then whoever else they decide to bring in through the conversations at wide receiver, versatile should be the theme for the offense. And it seems like it's trending that way.
And hopefully a little bit more deep passing, which is really something we didn't see a whole lot of, probably because of the line, could also be because of the receivers they had last year. But, that's always been a strength of Daniel Jones's game, and just really not one that we saw a whole lot of. I think the Giants were ranked last in explosive plays last year.
Yeah. And, when you look at some of that, like Paris Campbell, probably not going to be that guy that takes the top off. Jamison Crowder, we know he's more of the intermediate stuff. And so, yeah, they're going to have to probably still go out and find that guy at some point, because you're absolutely right. This is the Daniel Jones exploration. We see every franchise that has a quarterback that they're interested in finding answers on do some version of this. Now, it was the Browns years ago doing that and getting an answer that they didn't like with Baker Mayfield. And, we saw Lamar Jackson and the Ravens kind of go through this unsuccessfully because they weren't able to hit on those wide receiver weapons that were going to help him out in the same ways. But that's the process. We've seen that as sort of the proving ground for these quarterbacks around the NFL for a while.
All right. Now, same question for you regarding the defense. Obviously, the two big fishes, if you will, Nacho and Okereke, they didn't really, they added a little bit to the back end of it with Amani, the former Lion. I'm still learning his last name, how to say that last name. And then they also added Bobby McCain. But what, if anything, can we learn from these moves as far as how maybe Wink Martindale plans to evolve the defense in year two?
Man, I don't know if Wink and evolution are necessarily what I think, because, man, that man is as consistent as any force in my life. It's probably the John Wick movies and Wink Martindale are the things that I know I'll be able to count on in perpetuity for never really changing up what they do. And so, you need incredibly smart athletic guys who are able to do a lot of things. And when it comes to what you've got on the back end, that puts a lot of added pressure on you as far as the abilities that you're going to need to be able to stomach what he's asking of you, to be able to hold up in isolation, to be able to hold up when you're on an island. So I think those needs in Wink's defense are always going to be the same. And so having, a veteran at least in Bobby at that linebacker spot, that's always important. You need guys from the neck up that are going to be able to stomach a lot of this stuff. You need, we've talked about on the defensive line, you've got the edge guys to get after it. And so now it's really going to be just fleshing out and making sure that you've got the secondary that can hold up for that final portion of it, trying to find maybe even some playmakers in there. We know last year, the year-long storyline of when are the Giants going to get their first interception from the secondary? When's this finally going to come? Shout out to my boy Julian Love for pulling down interception number 1. But, with a presence like his gone, now you've got to start to restock the coffers there a bit.
Yeah, I wondered if last year they put a lot on the safeties plate, maybe because the linebackers were, maybe not up to snuff, if you will. And I wondered if maybe that would be a shift, with adding Okereke. They're going to have Darian Beavers back. And it sounds like, they have, as we record this, they were meeting with Deion Jones, former Falcon linebacker, Pro Bowler, who's, for a few years ago. So I thought maybe they're putting more of an emphasis maybe on the linebacker play as opposed to take some of that onus off of the safeties. I mean, I don't know. Do you see it that way as well?
Yeah, listen, it very much could be that way. I think depending on how your defense is structured, every level usually has a communicator, but we know the powerhouse of the defense, the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell is usually someone in the middle back end there. So either the linebacker, safety, whoever your green dot player is. And if you've got a veteran in the middle of that linebacker core, then yeah, he could take some off the plate. I think all football, you kind of see that, right? On the offensive side, it's, hey, you got a young quarterback, but you got a veteran center. Put a little bit more on him as far as identifying things, communicating, make it more of a conversation with a young guy versus later on when you've got a quality veteran quarterback, he can come up and dictate the terms to everyone. He can see everything. And so if you've got, if you're figuring out what you want your nucleus to be at safety, or you're breaking in new guys like you were in that linebacker core almost all of last year, if you've got the continuity there, then yeah, it would make sense to say, all right, let that player see the field right now. Let a guy with a lot of NFL snaps under him go out there, see the field and identify these things, and then let him be the one to communicate and basically have the last word, right? Everyone's got checks and overrides in what they do. Everyone's got mechanisms they can use, but you often will defer more of that responsibility to the player that you trust the most in that, for sure.
One of Joe Schoen's goals this offseason was to close the gap with Dallas and the Eagles being a loaded team. Now, I know the Eagles lost some guys, but when you look at the moves that have been made so far, how much have the Giants closed the gap with Dallas and the Eagles?
I mean, Dallas, you can make a little bit more of an argument with, just because that's a team that year to year, I'm worried about the consistency of. They've got a lot of things changing. Obviously, Mike McCarthy taking over the play calling with no Kellen Moore there. The Zeke Elliott era is now over in Dallas. They're trying to figure out what exactly they're going to do with the exteriors of their offensive line now, with Terrence Steele, with what they had last year. Their young tackle, Tyler Smith, taking a step up while you had, Tyron Smith injured. So, and for them, the issue always ended up being stopping the run down the stretch of the season, kind of similar to what it was for the Giants. But I think the Eagles are still pretty clearly the class of this division. We know defensively they took a hit, but being able to re-sign Darius Slay and get him back in there, losing Hargraves on the defensive line, that's sort of a pretty big blow, but that was a defense that had 70 sacks across the board. They had it coming from everywhere. They had 4 guys, I think, with double-digit sacks. And so because of that and because of the nucleus on offense that comes back, they're going to walk into this season heads and tails the favorite. The Giants, I think the draft will tell us a lot about how much ground they could potentially make up with a team like the Dallas Cowboys, who, as we've gone along, we've realized, all right, Jalen Hurts is in his ascent right now. He's probably due for a big payday sometime soon, and coming off his best performance in the Super Bowl this last season. For Dak Prescott, we got a lot of time under task with him, and I think we've realized Dak Prescott is a very good quarterback, top 10 quarterback, top 12 quarterback on his best day. But he's one that does need some of the structural help around him. It can't just be drop back 50 times and make it go. And I think that automatically puts them, at least in an attainable range if Daniel Jones keeps making the jump that we saw last year, that maybe he can get closer to that kind of style of play and make them a team that's competitive with the Cowboys.
And I think, and tell me if you disagree, but you look at the receivers in the NFC East, you got McLaurin down in Washington, CeeDee Lamb over in Dallas. You've got A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith in Philly. So if you're the Giants, I would, my opinion at any rate, if you want to really close that gap, I would think you'd want to improve on the back end because you got to get guys to cover those speedsters. I mean, do you agree with that? Or is there another area that you think the Giants can really make up some good ground in closing the gap with those teams?
Well, yeah, I mean, run defense has got to be, to me, the number one. Like, yeah, you absolutely want guys that are going to be able to go with them, but your division became one of the throwback divisions in football last year with how the Cowboys and how the Eagles decided to play ball. We'll see what Washington develops into now, but I think the identity of this division is on the ground. The Eagles got to the Super Bowl through incredible physicality and then timely passing around that. Their offense could do everything, but I think that's because it was so solid up front. And we ended up seeing when things finally went sideways for the Giants in the postseason, it was because you couldn't stop anybody on the ground. And so I think that's still got to be the number one focus. Clearly, some of the additions already in the front seven would indicate that has been heard. And then you layer in that back end from there, because you're absolutely right. You got to be ready for that off-speed pitch too.
And then finally, Mike, when you look at the draft, I mean, every year there's going to be something that just sets everybody on their ear. There's a surprise nobody sees coming. What are you hearing, or what do you anticipate is just going to make people say, whoa, I didn't see that coming at all?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds tired because we all spend a lot of time with this quarterback situation, but I guess this is a bad answer to this question, because I wouldn't be stunned if a team like Carolina swung at Anthony Richardson and said that could be the guy for us at the top of the draft. We've seen this sort of steady rise for him. And I think we've also seen the conversation around him change a lot. Every time smart people start watching Anthony Richardson, it goes from, it's not just toolsy, it's not just backflips and fun stuff, it's not just incredible gifts like we saw at the Combine, it's, oh, this guy's a little bit further along in the process than most people expect when they get the billing he gets publicly versus what actually shows up on the tape when you watch him over the course of what are only 12 starts. And that's the biggest wild card with him. But I think you look at the way Carolina's structured, from bringing back their offensive line that became a strength down the end of the season, from a defense that's certainly going to be something that's hospitable for your rookie quarterback. I just think they could potentially be in position. And now all of a sudden, I think that changes the calculus on, what happens there. That, and quite honestly, if he falls, Seattle then becomes, I think, the next most interesting team, because they're in a spot where, yeah, Geno Smith kind of signed on a, Daniel Jones-like deal. Could they bring in and start to get another quarterback ready? Would they go for one of the blue chip defensive prospects? We know what happens with Will Anderson, Jalen Carter, especially in light of what's going on with him off the field. How does that affect his draft status? We know Drew Rosenhaus doesn't think he's getting out of the top 10, but how those guys start to slide is going to inform so much of the back half of the draft. And that includes teams that might get froggy and start to trade up for guys that they like, especially in the edge and tackle market.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because, like I said, there's always something that the NFL community, the scouting community sees that nobody's talking about on the outside, despite how much time we all spend looking at it. And, the draft is such an exciting time. And, I always said that the draft should come before free agency. I don't know how you feel about that, but to me, it makes more sense to do it that way.
I mean, listen, if I was the one building a team, I would absolutely like it that way, right? Get my low cost expenditures out of the way, get my long-term projects, and then use that as sort of the foundation, because I think that's how most organizations view the draft anyway, right? Is you want to be a team that builds through the draft. You want to set your foundation that way because you've got all this contract control, and then be able to go out and spend in free agency. I'm with you, but listen, the NFL has certainly found a product in the offseason that's incredibly compelling and fun for all of us. They've had me eating out of the palm of their hand even since the final whistle of the Super Bowl. They just refuse to stop.
Yeah, I mean, it is a year-round sport to cover. There really is no break except for that period right after spring football ends and start of training camp, and that's 6 weeks, so it's really no break. But
the shortest 6 weeks in the calendar year. It's unreal.
Oh, it really is. I mean, the next thing I know, it's like, okay, yay, we're on summer break, and then suddenly it's like, oh, it's time for training camp. But you know what? I love it. I've been doing it for so long. I love it. I know you love it, being a former player and now an analyst and whatnot. So Great stuff, Mike. I appreciate you coming back on the program with me. Folks, you can find him on the GoJo Podcast. He's one of the co-hosts over there on DraftKings. And keep it here on the Locked On Giants podcast all week long. We've got plenty more coming up. For Mike Golic Jr., I'm Patricia Trainer. Thanks so much for tuning in, Giant fans. We'll talk to you soon.